The story begins not with aircraft, but with the automobile. For decades, Henry Ford had been the master of mass production, the man who had perfected the assembly line and brought motor cars to millions of families. Yet by the time the world was sliding into the chaos of the Second World War, Ford Motor Company was about to face a challenge unlike anything in its history. Cars were one thing. But aircraft? That was an entirely different world. The United States, still emerging from the Great Depression, was rapidly preparing itself for a conflict that many felt was inevitable. Across the Atlantic, the skies over Europe were filled with bombers and fighters. Germany's Luftwaffe had become a symbol of industrial and military power. Britain was holding out, but only just, its factories constantly under siege. America's industrial might was needed, but converting that power into actual aircraft production was far from simple. The United States Army Air Forces had a problem. The B-17 Flying Fortress, famous and beloved, was an excellent heavy bomber. But the Army needed more than one type of heavy bomber. They needed numbers, and they needed speed. The Consolidated Aircraft Corporation had developed the B-24 Liberator, a bomber that, on paper, could outperform the B-17 in range, speed, and payload. The B-24 was longer, sleeker, and its high aspect ratio wing gave it advantages over its rivals. The problem was not the design. The problem was scale. Consolidated could not build enough B-24s to meet the war demand. Their production lines were limited, their capacity stretched. And so the U.S. government turned to a company that, at first glance, had no business building planes, Ford Motor Company. The idea was radical. Ford would build bombers the way it built cars. The Willow Run plant in Michigan would become the centerpiece of this dream. It would not just be a factory, it would be the largest industrial complex ever built for the purpose of assembling aircraft. Here, thousands of men and women, many of whom had never before even seen an airplane up close, would be trained to assemble one of the most complex machines of the war. The B-24 Liberator was no simple machine. It was composed of approximately 1.5 million individual parts, sourced from hundreds of subcontractors and suppliers across the United States. In total, more than 300,000 separate subassemblies were required to complete a single bomber. It had 4 engines, retractable landing gear, hydraulics, oxygen systems, turrets, radios, fuel tanks, bomb racks, and miles of wiring. The challenge was staggering. At first, even Ford engineers were doubtful. An automobile was one thing. Hundreds of parts, simple assembly lines, interchangeable components. But a 4-engine heavy bomber was almost alien in its complexity. William Knudsen, a former General Motors executive who had been appointed to oversee U.S. war production, believed Ford could do it. And Henry Ford, despite being skeptical of war itself, relished the challenge. Construction of the Willow Run plant began in 1941. It was an engineering marvel before a single plane had even been assembled. Designed by architect Albert Kahn, the factory stretched nearly a mile long, with a total floor area of more than 3.5 million square feet. Its layout included a mile-long assembly line that would snake through the building, beginning with raw materials at one end and finishing with completed bombers taxiing out onto the airfield at the other. At its peak, the plant would employ more than 40,000 workers. Many were women, entering industrial work for the first time as part of the growing Rosie the Riveter movement. Others were men who had previously worked in Detroit's car factories. Training was intense. These workers had to learn riveting, welding, electrical wiring, and precision fitting. They had to become aircraft builders almost overnight. Ford executives quickly realized that building a bomber was nothing like building a car. Early attempts at production were disastrous. In 1942, after months of preparation, Ford's first completed B-24 rolled off the line, and it was almost unusable. Quality control was a nightmare. Sections of the aircraft did not align properly. Subassemblies arrived late or were mismatched. The sheer scale of the bomber's systems overwhelmed Ford's carefully planned production methods. But Ford did not give up. Adjustments were made, teams were reorganized, and processes were refined. Specialized jigs and fixtures were built to ensure precision. Subcontractors were pressured to improve quality and timing. Workers were retrained, and managers learned to adapt automobile-style efficiency to aviation's unforgiving requirements. Slowly, the pace increased. In early 1943, Willow Run was producing a handful of bombers per month, then dozens. By mid-1944, the plant was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The statistics were staggering. The assembly line ran around the clock with 3 shifts a day. More than 8,600 bombers were built at Willow Run alone, out of nearly 18,500 total B-24s produced during the war. The Germans, who had invested heavily in aircraft production themselves, were stunned. Their intelligence services had estimated American production capacity, but they had not anticipated the scale of Willow Run. Reports filtered back to Berlin. Ford was producing 4-engine bombers at a pace faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Every hour, a new Liberator rolled out of the factory, ready to join the Allied air campaign. The German high command could hardly believe it. A bomber with 1.5 million parts, built faster than they could shoot them down? It was industrial warfare, on a scale the world had never seen before. But numbers alone do not capture the human story. Each bomber that rolled off the line carried with it the sweat and determination of thousands of American workers. Many were women, balancing factory work with family life. Many were African Americans, hired into industrial jobs that had long been closed to them. Together, they represented a mobilization of society that blurred the lines between civilian and military effort. Inside the factory, the sights and sounds were unforgettable. Sparks flew from welding torches. Riveters hammered away at the metal skin of fuselages. Huge cranes lifted wings into position, lowering them onto the waiting bodies of bombers. Engines were hoisted into place, their gleaming cylinders a symbol of American horsepower. At the end of the line, bombers emerged one after another, rolling onto the adjacent airfield, where test pilots waited to take them skyward. The Willow Run experiment was more than just a feat of production. It was a statement. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, capable of producing weapons of war on a scale unmatched by any other nation. And Ford, once the company of the Model T, had proven that the same industrial genius that brought cars to the masses could bring bombers to the battlefield. For German intelligence, it was a sobering realization. Their own factories, limited by bombing raids, labor shortages, and less efficient production methods, could not hope to match such output. The Luftwaffe would continue to fight, but the balance had shifted. In the skies over Europe, the roar of B-24 engines grew louder with each passing day. If the outside world saw Willow Run as a symbol of American industrial power, the people inside knew it as something far more complicated. The factory floor was a world unto itself, a city of steel, machinery, and human effort. It was a place where everyday Americans transformed themselves into aircraft builders, one rivet, one wire, one engine at a time. The scale of the plant itself was overwhelming. When new workers arrived, many of them were stunned by its sheer size. The main assembly line stretched nearly a mile. Workers would say you could enter the building in the morning, walk to your station, and not see daylight again until your shift ended late at night. The noise was constant. The pounding of rivet guns, the roar of engines being tested, the shriek of steel against steel. Communication on the floor often meant shouting to be heard. It was here that Ford faced one of its greatest challenges: the workforce itself. Unlike automobile plants, which drew primarily from experienced factory labor, Willow Run needed tens of thousands of workers almost overnight. That meant hiring people who had never set foot in an industrial plant before. Farmers, housewives, clerks, high school graduates, they all became part of the great experiment. Women made up a significant portion of the workforce. Many of their husbands, brothers, and sons were already serving overseas. These women became icons of the era, immortalized in the Rosie the Riveter image. At Willow Run, they learned to handle pneumatic drills, to read technical blueprints, to crawl inside narrow fuselage sections and secure rivets from impossible angles. They worked long shifts, often in conditions that were dirty, hot, and physically exhausting. One worker later recalled, "It wasn't glamorous. You came home with your hands sore, your ears ringing, and your clothes smelling of oil and metal. But you knew that every bolt you tightened, every wire you connected, meant another bomber could fly over Europe and bring the war closer to an end." African American workers also played a crucial role at Willow Run, though they faced discrimination even as they contributed to the war effort. Many were assigned the toughest and dirtiest jobs, yet they persevered. The factory, in its own way, became a social experiment, forcing Americans of different backgrounds to work side by side for a common cause. For many, it was their first real experience of integration in the workplace. The logistics of production were staggering. Each B-24 required 1.5 million parts, and those parts had to arrive on time, in the right sequence, and in the right condition. Trains and trucks delivered constant streams of materials to the factory: aluminum sheets, rubber tires, hydraulic pumps, radios, engines, machine guns, plexiglass for the turrets, wiring harnesses by the mile. Subcontractors from across the nation fed the assembly line. A single delay in one part of the chain could stall production for hours. Inside Willow Run, the assembly process was broken down into hundreds of specialized tasks. Workers rarely saw the finished bomber until it rolled off the line. Instead, they focused on one small job, repeated over and over with relentless precision. A riveter might spend an entire shift driving rivets into a wing section. An electrician might spend days threading cables through the fuselage. But what made Willow Run unique was the attempt to apply Ford's automobile assembly line principles to aviation. Aircraft had traditionally been built in smaller plants, almost by hand, with teams of craftsmen working on individual planes. At Willow Run, Ford turned that model on its head. Subassemblies moved down the line in stages, with workers performing specific tasks before passing them to the next station. Fuselages and wings met at carefully timed intervals, guided by giant cranes and fixtures. Engines were mounted in sequence. The process was not perfect. Misalignments and errors were frequent, but the pace was unmatched. At first, progress was slow. In 1942, the plant produced only a handful of bombers, and critics began to whisper that the Willow Run experiment was a failure. But by 1943, the process began to smooth out. Workers gained experience, managers refined workflows, and engineers corrected production flaws. The output soared. By mid-1944, Willow Run had become the single most productive aircraft plant in the world. A bomber that once took months to build could now be completed in just over an hour. The assembly line never stopped. 3 shifts worked around the clock, with thousands of workers pouring in and out at all hours. The nearby town of Ypsilanti was transformed. Housing shortages became common, traffic jams clogged local roads, and the entire region pulsed with the rhythms of war production. Yet the pace was grueling. Workers often endured 12-hour shifts. Heat in the summer was suffocating, with temperatures on the floor climbing past 100 degrees. In the winter, drafts of icy air blew through the vast building, leaving workers shivering as they worked with frozen fingers. Absenteeism became a problem, and Ford managers had to implement strict attendance rules. Still, the workforce endured, motivated by patriotism, wages, and the sense that their labor was part of something far larger than themselves. One of the most iconic moments for workers came when the first fully operational B-24 rolled off the line and took to the skies from Willow Run's own airfield. Crowds of workers gathered to watch, cheering as the massive bomber lifted off, proof that their labor had become a flying fortress of its own. For the German intelligence officers tracking Allied production, reports from America seemed almost unbelievable. Factories that had once turned out automobiles were now producing aircraft by the thousands. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war as the most advanced air force in the world, was now outnumbered by the flood of Allied bombers pouring across the Atlantic. For every German fighter built, America and Britain could produce several bombers, and the B-24 was everywhere. Willow Run's aircraft joined the fleets that bombed German industry, attacked submarine bases, and supported operations from North Africa to Italy to France. In the Pacific, B-24s flew long-range missions against Japanese targets, their range giving them a unique advantage in the vast expanses of the ocean war. But behind every mission was the relentless hum of Willow Run. The workers who never saw combat, who never left Michigan, were nonetheless part of the fight. Each bomber was a piece of their lives, a testament to their endurance, their training, and their willingness to adapt. Willow Run had become not only a factory, but a symbol. It showed what could happen when a nation mobilized its industry, when ordinary citizens took on extraordinary tasks, and when the power of assembly line production was applied to one of the most complex machines of the 20th century. And yet, as incredible as it was, the challenges were far from over. Building bombers at record speed was one thing. Keeping up with the constant need for parts, dealing with the inevitable mistakes, and managing a restless workforce, that was another. The story of Willow Run was not just about speed. It was about the constant struggle to make the impossible possible. If building the Willow Run factory was an engineering marvel, keeping it supplied was nothing short of a logistical miracle. The B-24 Liberator was not just an airplane. It was a puzzle of 1.5 million pieces, and each one had to be in the right place, at the right time, and in the right condition. A single missing component, a hydraulic pump, a fuel valve, a section of wiring, could stall the entire line. The truth was this. Willow Run did not simply assemble airplanes. It sat at the center of a vast, invisible web of suppliers, subcontractors, and transportation routes. Every day, boxcars, trucks, and freight trains arrived at the plant loaded with crates and containers. Aluminum sheets, rubber seals, fuel tanks, electrical systems, and machine gun turrets arrived from factories all across the United States. The choreography was immense. Ford's managers quickly learned that aircraft logistics bore little resemblance to automobile logistics. Car parts could be stockpiled easily, and many were standardized across models. But bomber parts were specialized, often handmade, and manufactured by companies with no experience in mass production. If one subcontractor failed to deliver, Willow Run's mile-long assembly line could grind to a halt. To solve this, Ford developed one of the most advanced supply chain management systems of the era. Teams were assigned to monitor every supplier, every shipment, and every stage of the journey. Railroads became lifelines. Entire freight yards were devoted to keeping Willow Run fed with parts. Workers learned to expect crates stamped with names from across the nation. Bendix, Pratt and Whitney, Sperry, Goodyear, and hundreds of others. At its peak, more than 1,000 subcontractors were feeding parts into the Willow Run system. Radios came from one factory, oxygen tanks from another, landing gear from a third. Ford itself produced massive subassemblies, including wing sections and fuselage segments, which then had to be perfectly timed with parts arriving from other states. But timing was never perfect. Trains derailed. Shipments were delayed by storms. A supplier might produce faulty components, forcing Ford to scramble for replacements. Managers at Willow Run became crisis managers, juggling shortages, delays, and quality control disasters while still keeping the line moving. Inside the plant, workers felt these pressures directly. Imagine riveting a section of wing only to discover that the next component, a hydraulic line, a bracket, a section of skin, hadn't arrived. Entire crews might be reassigned, their schedules thrown into chaos. Managers kept charts, schedules, and endless stacks of paperwork just to track which sections of bomber were on time and which were lagging. Quality was another battlefield. The B-24 required precision. Its engines had to be mounted with exact alignment. Its wings had to carry immense loads without buckling. Early on, many subassemblies simply didn't fit together. Ford's automobile-trained engineers had designed jigs and fixtures to force precision, but suppliers sometimes delivered parts that were off by fractions of an inch. On a car, that might be tolerable. On a bomber, it was deadly. One inspector later recalled, "We would get entire shipments of components that just didn't fit. You couldn't force them into place. We had to send them back, and that meant delays." We learned the hard way that aviation wasn't forgiving the constant battle to maintain quality pushed Ford to innovate. They began to impose stricter quality control standards on subcontractors. Specialized inspectors were sent out to supplier factories to enforce compliance. Gradually, standards improved. By 1944, the supply chain had become one of the most disciplined in the world. Another problem was storage. A mile-long factory required staggering amounts of inventory. Crates piled high in warehouses, parts stacked to the rafters, and forklifts buzzing back and forth. Even with constant deliveries, space was always running short. Ford's managers began implementing what would later be recognized as an early version of just-in-time production, an attempt to keep parts moving directly from train cars to the line without wasting precious storage space. Then there was the issue of engines. The B-24 used 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines, among the most reliable radial engines of the war. But each one was a masterpiece of engineering, requiring thousands of precise parts and careful assembly. Ensuring a steady flow of engines to Willow Run became one of the most critical aspects of production. Without engines, the line would stop dead. Pratt & Whitney factories were pushed to their limits, and Ford sometimes had to build stockpiles just in case deliveries lagged. Despite these challenges, the plant pushed forward. Managers learned to expect chaos. A shipment might be delayed, but another shipment would arrive early. A faulty subassembly might cause one plane to stall, but the line would keep moving, filling gaps with planes further down the chain. The key was flexibility. Willow Run was not a rigid system. It was a living machine, constantly adapting to circumstances. And it worked. By the middle of the war, Willow Run had become a symbol not just of American industrial power, but of American problem-solving. The Germans could not understand how a nation could produce complex aircraft at such speed. But the answer was not just the assembly line. It was the entire ecosystem that fed the line, the thousands of suppliers, inspectors, engineers, and workers who made sure that every nut, every bolt, every section of wing arrived when it was needed. Workers on the floor sometimes joked that they weren't building airplanes. They were solving puzzles. Every day brought new problems, and every day they had to find solutions. It was exhausting, but it was also empowering. They were not just workers. They were part of the largest industrial experiment in human history. By late 1943, Ford had ironed out many of the worst problems. Parts flowed more smoothly, quality improved, and the line ran with greater efficiency. By 1944, Willow Run reached its legendary pace. A completed B-24 Liberator rolling off the line every 63 minutes. The numbers were mind-boggling. No other nation in the world could match such output. And yet, the story of Willow Run was not only about numbers. It was also about people. Each worker had a story. The young woman who left her farm to work on wiring harnesses, the African-American man who fought for a place on the line despite discrimination, the older mechanic who retrained to become an aircraft inspector. Their lives were bound up in the rhythm of the factory. For many, the work was more than a job. It was a way to fight. They could not fly the bombers, but they could build them. And in building them, they knew they were striking blows against fascism with every rivet, every weld, every finished plane. The logistical nightmare had become a logistical triumph. Willow Run was not just producing airplanes. It was producing hope. Hope that the war could be won, hope that industry could outpace destruction, hope that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when called upon. And as the bombers rolled off the line, one after another, that hope took wing. The B-24 Liberator may have rolled out of Willow Run in steel and rivets, but its foundations were built on human lives. Behind the statistics of production, one bomber every 63 minutes, lay the struggles of tens of thousands of men and women who made it possible. For them, Willow Run was not only a workplace, it was a way of life, a force that reshaped their families, their communities, and their futures. The first problem they faced was housing. When Willow Run opened, Ypsilanti was a quiet town, with a population of barely 5,000. Within months, tens of thousands of new workers flooded in, overwhelming every street, every boarding house, every spare room. People slept wherever they could, in rented attics, in converted barns, sometimes even in their cars. The housing shortage became so acute that the U.S. government intervened, building hastily constructed neighborhoods known as Willow Run Village. These were not idyllic homes. They were rows of cheaply built units, often crowded, sometimes without proper plumbing, and filled with the constant noise of families trying to live on top of one another. Yet they became the heart of the Willow Run community. Children played in the mud between barracks-like homes, while mothers juggled housework with factory shifts. For many families, it was the first taste of urban life, and it was chaotic, messy, and unforgettable. Transportation was another daily battle. The plant was so enormous that getting to work could take hours. Traffic jams clogged the roads leading into the factory, with buses, cars, and bicycles converging in endless streams. Many workers had to rise before dawn to secure a seat on a crowded bus, endure a bone-rattling ride across Michigan roads, and then work a 10 or 12-hour shift before heading back into the traffic nightmare at night. Once inside the factory, the grind was relentless. Shifts rotated around the clock: day, evening, and graveyard. Some workers never saw daylight for weeks at a time, their lives governed by the factory whistle rather than the rising sun. Meals were rushed, a sandwich eaten beside a machine, coffee gulped between tasks. Families adjusted to new rhythms, with children often cared for by neighbors or older siblings while mothers worked the line. Fatigue became a silent enemy. Long hours, heavy labor, and constant noise wore people down. Injuries were common: cuts, burns, hearing loss, repetitive stress from endless riveting and welding. Doctors later recalled the Willow Run cough, a mixture of dust, smoke, and fatigue that seemed to hang over the plant like a permanent haze. And yet, despite these hardships, the sense of purpose remained powerful. Workers knew why they were there. The war was not an abstract idea. Many had loved ones overseas. Letters from the front reminded them of what was at stake. Each completed bomber felt personal, as if it carried their contribution into battle. But patriotism did not erase conflict. Labor tensions flared inside Willow Run. Workers demanded fair wages, safer conditions, and better hours. Strikes occasionally halted production, infuriating government officials who saw any delay as a direct threat to the war effort. Union organizers clashed with Ford's notoriously anti-union management. Negotiations were heated, but in the end, most disputes were resolved quickly. The war left little room for prolonged conflict. The social fabric of Willow Run was equally complex. The workforce was a mix of rural migrants, city dwellers, women entering industry for the first time, and African Americans who faced daily discrimination. Some white workers resented the presence of black colleagues. Some men resisted the idea of women working beside them on equal terms, but the demands of war forced cooperation. Slowly, prejudices began to erode, at least within the walls of the plant. Stories of resilience emerged from this melting pot. A single mother who worked 12-hour shifts while raising 3 children. A retired farmer who retrained as a machinist at the age of 60. A group of teenagers who lied about their age to secure factory jobs and contribute to the war effort. These were the invisible soldiers of the home front, their sacrifices no less real than those of the men in uniform. Beyond the factory gates, the community pulsed with wartime energy. Bars and diners were packed after shifts, serving tired workers looking for a moment of escape. Churches organized childcare for mothers on the line. Schools overflowed with the children of workers, forcing teachers to adapt to classrooms twice their normal size. Everything in Ypsilanti revolved around the plant. Life was noisy, crowded, and exhausting, but it was also alive with purpose. There was also a darker side. Alcoholism rose, fueled by stress and exhaustion. Families broke under the pressure of endless shifts and separation. Some workers simply could not cope, walking away from their jobs despite the stigma of abandoning the war effort. The glamour of Rosie the Riveter posters did not always match the grim reality of factory life. Yet for many, Willow Run became a defining chapter of their lives. Years later, workers would recall the pride of walking into that enormous factory, of being part of something larger than themselves. They remembered the friends they made, the skills they learned, the sense that their hands had helped shape history. And above all, they remembered the sight of the bombers. Finished B-24s rolling out of the factory, engines roaring, wings gleaming in the Michigan sun. Each one was proof that their sacrifices had meaning. Each one carried a piece of their lives into the war. The story of Willow Run was not just about machines, it was about people. Ordinary Americans, called to do extraordinary things, reshaped their lives around a factory that never slept. They bore the fatigue, the overcrowding, the noise, the injuries, the discrimination, and the endless grind because they believed the war demanded it.